We call this session Introduction to Process Management, which we realize is kind of a vague term. Hopefully we'll explain that as we go through this session exactly what that means. And this is just an introduction. Process management is kind of a big topic. There's a lot to cover in terms of all of the pieces of it. What we hope to do in this session is to give you get you oriented about what process management is and kind of what the pieces are, how they fit together, so that you can find your way around depending on what you're wanting to do. That would come under the heading of process management. Displaying on my screen now the community site help page for process management that we'll be talking about. You can also get to this page on the help tab of your site. Just may be a little bit easier to read over here on the community site. The first thing that we want to cover is the edit form link, which I'll be using in the session, and you'll find that it's very helpful for you in terms of doing your process management, editing your forms. I'll just flip to one of our demo sites and show you the link that I'm talking about. And in the new interface, if you have this permission set, which I'll show you, then you'll see an admin menu whenever you're on a dynamic form, and that will provide you an edit form link. It's a really handy link, as I'll show you, because if you're on the form, you want to change, you can edit it directly with that link. And then once you're done editing, it'll take you back to this form so you can see the effect of your changes without having to go through the admin page and finding the form manually. I'll flip to our other demo site that uses the classic interface just to show you where that link will show up. There's no menu bar at the top of the page in the classic interface. Everything appears on the right side. And the edit form link, if you have the permission turned on for your role, will appear at the very lower right of the right side taskbar area. If you don't see that link, the way to turn it on is at the permission in your user roles. So to do that, you would go to your admin tab. And then locate the user roles permissions page. In the new interface here, I'm just clicking on user management on the left, and then I can see user roles permissions here in the center, where I could have used the search box and type role for permissions, and that would show me that page. I'm going to assume everyone on this session is an administrator. So on the roles page, you would click on the administrator role. And then in the list of internal permissions, you scroll down and there is a view edit form link permission, and just make sure that box is checked. If your site uses external permissions as well, and you're going to be connecting externally, then you would want to make sure that your role had that permission. If you need to check the box to give your role that permission, click on the Continue button to save that change, and now you'll be able to see that edit form link. Let me just give you a quick idea of how that link can save you time. If I'm on, for example, this applicant demographics form, which is part of an intake, and I wanted to change something on this form, with that link, I can just go to Edit, Admin, and Edit Form. And that will open up the form in edit mode for me, for the back end of the form. where I can go in and make changes, rearrange fields, take fields off, and so forth. Without that link, what I would need to do to get to that form is go to the admin page. In the process management section, there's a link for processes, forms, and profiles, which we'll talk about in more detail. And then I would need to know which module I'm in, what my form is in, and I would need to come to my primary forms, find that particular form, and I would need to know or remember the name of it, which happens to be, I think, applicant demographics. So that's on page 2. Find that form, click the edit pencil, or in the classic interface, it'll just be the word edit. There'll be a link that you can click. And that would take us to the same place that we were before, which is the back end of this form. So you can see how the edit form link is worthwhile to turn on, and it'll save you a lot of time. And it also will, you don't have to worry about knowing exactly what the form's name is. There might be, multiple forms on your site with very similar names, and you might actually grab the wrong form, going about it the wrong way. So coming back to the help page, as it explains to you, the process management can be something very simple, which is I want to add a field to an intake form, or I want to make a field required, or I want to make it unrequired, something like that. It can also be something that's much more complex, which is my site is still using the static user forms and process, and I want to completely replace that with a dynamic process and dynamic forms, because I want to control the fields that are asked or filled out during the user creation process. Or likewise for timekeeping. If your site is still using static timekeeping, maybe you want to convert over to dynamic, and because you want control over the forms and the process and so forth. As you can see on the page for process management, anytime you see a page that has a table of contents that looks like this, there's quite a few pieces to it. The first thing that you need to know about dealing with process management is the idea of modules. And as explained here, modules are the highest level of object, or kind of the highest level of division of things within LegalServer. So your various modules, your case matter module, outreach module, timekeeping module, the user module, and so forth. The module is, you have to know which module you're in, because if we come back to the processes, forms, and profiles page, which is where you do most of your process management, then the module is the first selection that you can make on this page. It always defaults to the case matter module, and that's what shows you all the various processes, forms, profiles, and other pieces that make up part of that module. If I change this, for example, to the user module and click the View Edit button, you can see the list of processes change, and of course the list on all these other tabs, the forms will change, and so forth. If I change it to timekeeping, then again the list will change. You can see on this demo site, for example, we have only one process for adding case time, and so this demo site probably has a static process for the other types of times. And we'll talk about what dynamic means and what static means and so forth. If it's not clear which module you're dealing with, then typically if you look at the URL for the page that you're on, that will give you a clue about which module you happen to be on. So let me come back to the front end of this applicant demographics form. Now, if you've used LegalServer for a while, it'll be pretty obvious to you that this is an intake process, and we can see we're on the applicant demographics step of the intake. What shows up over on the left or what shows up over on the right in the classic interface is going to be the name of the form and so forth. But if you're not sure, if you look at the URL of the page you're on, it's going to contain the name of the module that you're currently in. In this case, maybe a little bit hard to see on the remote end, but I can see after the site name that I see /matter. So that tells me that I'm in the matter module, sometimes called the case matter module. If I was on a time slip, then it would tell me that I was in the service module. That's one of the differences that you just need to know, is that the service module is what is also sometimes called the timekeeping module. Now, each one of the modules is going to have processes, forms, and profiles. And there may be some other elements involved as well, particularly in the case matter module. There's some additional elements. So this is just terminology in terms of, what is a process, what is a form, what is a profile that you just have to learn. So we give you an example on the community page that the process, form, and profile, the other way to think about that is the process is a link. The forms are where you do data entry, and then the profile page is typically just displaying information. So there are some exceptions here and there, but for the most part, you can think of it that way. So when we say, what is this process, which process are you working on? We're talking about typically about, which link are you clicking? Processes generally, they put a link somewhere, although there are uses for hidden processes that don't ever display a link. So you click on a link to initiate that process. It's going to call a form, or possibly going to call multiple forms. And then at the after you submit the only form in that process, or the last form in that process, you typically will end up on a profile page. So just talking about examples of that. We come back to the demo site. Right now we're in an intake process. And if I go to the home page, I can see over on the left-hand side on this demo site, we have 3 different intake processes that have been defined. And we also have a pre-screen process here. So if I go back over to the admin page and go back to case matter module, in the process list, I'm going to see a link for each one of those. And if I filter this list down by type, or intake type, and I can see there's the 3 processes for each one of those intakes. I can see for each one of those intakes the number of steps, which is also the number of forms that are in that process. And then I have an edit link where I can go into that process and make changes to the process itself, as opposed to the forms. Now, the intake processes on your site are probably the most complex processes that you'll have. A much simpler type of process, we'll just use an example. We'll go to the Actions menu on a case and click on the Add Case Note process on this demo site. Now this, as we can see over on the left-hand side, is just a one-step process, which many of your processes are, especially on cases like that. Also for time slips, adding time, it's just going to be one form. So the process, the link is Add Case Note. The one form comes up. And then once I fill out the form and click on the Continue button, It's going to take me back to a profile page, which in this case is the main profile on this demo site. If this was the intake process, it would step me through each one of those forms, and then when I got to the last form, which would typically be called something like disposition, and do something, then it's also going to take me to a profile page. In that case, for an intake process, it would probably take me to the same place as here, the main profile. If we're talking about timekeeping, we're going to click on a link like add case time, which is the process. It's going to show the time slip form. And then it might show me the time slip profile page. Sometimes it might take me back to the main timekeeping page itself. As I say, there's little exceptions and variations here. But for the most part, that's the way you can think of what processes, forms, and profiles are. The next thing that's very helpful to understand is this idea of static and dynamic processes. And so again, just some terminology that you need to become familiar with. The static processes are things that are built into LegalServer. Dynamic processes, which are the things we've been looking at already, are processes that you as a site administrator have a lot of control over. Generally static processes, there's nothing that you can do with them, although we'll see here in a second that there are some process settings page where you might be able to change things about those. But the dynamic processes, you have a lot of control over. So some of the things that are listed here regarding dynamic processes is that you can control who can see those links based on user role permissions. You determine the number and the order of the forms that the process calls. You also control the fields and elements that appear on those forms, and also which profile page is going to be displayed at the end of the process. The little tip here on this page we've already talked about, which is turning on that edit form link so that you can easily edit individual forms as you're working on them. It also explains on this page about why some things are static, some things are dynamic, and that's primarily just historical. But what that means as a practical matter is, let's go back to the profile on a case. And as we've already seen, if I clicked on add a case note, this is a dynamic process, and it doesn't have to have the word dynamic in parentheses like this example does. But I can tell this is a dynamic process, one, because if I have an admin menu and I have an edit form link. If I was in the classic interface, and if I looked at the bottom of the right-hand side, I would see the edit form link. I can also tell this is a dynamic process by looking at the URL. If you see the word dynamic in the URL when you're looking at a page, then that's going to let you know that it is definitely a dynamic form or possibly a dynamic profile page. If you don't see the word dynamic, it's probably a static process, and which means that you're not going to have that much control over it, and you typically can't change anything about that specific form. So on a dynamic form like this, if I go in to edit it, when we talk about the control that you have over the form, then in this form element section, this is where you can control which elements are displayed. So this is a very simple form. It just has a header, which says add case note, and then a block that says add case note. So just to take a really trivial example, you could drag that header element down into disabled, scroll down and click on continue. That's going to bring you back to the front end of the form, so you can immediately see the change that you made, and you can see that header element is gone. So I'll edit the form again. I'll put the header element back there. And depending on the form, I could add additional elements here. So if this was like the applicant demographics form in your intake, this is where I could come in and add other fields and also make fields required, unrequired, and so forth. Let me quickly go back into an intake and to this applicant demographics page. And edit this form. So this is an example of one of the things that's relatively common that you might, as a site administrator, get a request to do. And say, during our intake, we've got the demographics page, and we're asking these different questions, but we want to ask a new question. So we want a new field on there, or we want a new instruction box, or we want this field to no longer be required, and so forth. So we can see there's quite a few different elements on this form. The header element is just that. It's just going to put a header on the form. We have a branch logic block here, which is kind of outside the scope of this particular session. And we have a field element for affected by the BP oil spill. If I click on the plus sign next to any one of these elements, it will expand that element and show me various options depending on what the element is. So the header element, for example, I have the text, applicant information that I can put there, and I can change that, of course. Does the header element text, does it contain HTML? I can say yes or no. I can also put in some hover text for that element. Then I have a special formatting section that I can, or option that I can set in there as well. For a field element, like this is just a straight field, like affected by the BP oil spill, I can see I can set this to no default, which means the field is going to be empty the first time it's seen on an intake or on a case, wherever it happens to be. I could default the value so that it starts out as no until somebody changes it. For a Boolean field, I can make the toggler style. I can make it a drop-down. I can make it radio buttons with roll-up. So I'll just make this one radio buttons and no. I have an option for default overrides existing value, which is not something commonly you would use, and it will do just what it kind of sounds like. So if I set this value to no and default overrides existing value, if somebody had previously set this field to yes, perhaps on another form, someplace else, and then they hit this form with this configuration, then that would change that over to no, overriding that existing value. And then if I submitted the form without changing it to yes, then it would flip it to no. I can also change the label that appears for this field. So the default label is the short name of the field. So I can change that on this particular form. I can select right of last here, which would make this display to the right of the previous field. Then I can make it required, bold, hidden, read only. Some of these are kind of obscure options that you may never use. Required is a real common one. So again, that type of thing, on our intake, we asked about the BP oil spill. It's not required. We need to make that required for whatever reason. Funding requirements, people aren't answering the question, so you want to make that required. Blocks also sometimes have configuration options. It just depends on the block in terms of how many they have. You can see, for example, this domestic violence block has several different options that you can select for it. Citizenship status, likewise, it has about 4 options. Some of the other blocks that you'll see on pages, for example, the financial information block, it has dozens of different options on it. So this all just relates back to that you can make changes on this particular form, and then the elements on it determine what changes you can make for whatever type of element it is. You can also see on this form we have some disabled elements. If you have a form that has a lot of disabled elements and you want to clean those up and get rid of those, there is a checkbox down at the bottom for every form that will let you delete those elements once you click on Continue. Sometimes it can be helpful to leave things disabled, so especially if you're kind of experimenting with things. You may want to leave something disabled so you don't have to add it back in. If you want to add an element to a form, you have the drop-down towards the bottom of that section. You can see the various elements that you can add. We won't go over all of these in detail. There's information on the help page about what the various elements do. The typical things you'll be adding are fields, blocks, and possibly instructions. Instruction elements are the yellow boxes, yellow background boxes that can appear on forms, and you just have free-form text in those. And so you just put those any place that's going to be helpful to people filling out the form to give them some sort of instruction. Fields are just what you would think. If you select fields, you will then get a box will appear out to the side or underneath that. This is a list of all of the fields that are available depending on the module you're in. So if we're on a case matter module that we're in right now, this is going to be, as you can see, a long list of fields. The list of fields will also depend on your site, what fields have been added to your site. Very helpful that you have a search box here. So if I was looking for a field that had date in the name, then I could type in date, and it would show me all of the fields that have date in the name. If I was looking for something more specific, type in CLOS, and it's just going to show me fields like case where we closed the case, closed reason, date closed, closing number, and so forth. If I select an element, select a field, I should say, if I want to add it to the form, I just click on the Add button. That's going to refresh the page. And if I scroll back down into the form element section, I can see it's added my field there. If this is where I want the field to appear at the very bottom of the page, then I could just leave it there, or I can drag it wherever I wanted it. The order here is the order that things will appear on the form. And if I click the plus sign, then I can set change any options for this particular field that I want to. You may notice for this field, since it's based on users, it's storing a user, then I have a different option that I saw with that other field. So one of the options is current user. That means that this form, as soon as somebody hit it, it would default to the person that's filling out the form. So fields have some common elements and then some common options, but depending on the type of data that's being stored, you will see some different options. So the date field, you'll see different options. The user-based field like that, you'll see different options. The other element that you'll typically be adding to your forms are blocks. So the same thing happens as with a field. You get a list of all the blocks that are available for this module, which for case matters, a whole lot of blocks. If we were working on a form over in the timekeeping module, then the list of blocks would be quite a bit shorter. Same thing for outreach, the user module, and so forth. Case matter is where you have the most fields and the most blocks. So you have the same thing in terms of you can use your search box or you can scroll through the list. You pick a block. Just like with the field element, you click on Add, or any other element, you click on Add. It's going to refresh the page, and it's going to put that block element at the bottom of the form. and you can drag it around. And again, you click your plus sign, you can see what configuration options are available to you for a block. If you're not familiar with blocks, what they are is typically blocks display one or more fields. Most often they display a couple of fields. And then they have code associated with them. So an example of that, for example, is like your address block. The address block puts several different fields on a form, all grouped together nicely. So your zip code, street address, city, state, zip, also county of residence, county dispute, depending on your configuration options. And there's also code associated with that. So you probably are familiar with the address block. If you type in the zip code, it will look up the city, the state, and the county field based on the zip code table. A field will just typically put a field on a form, and you can make your selection of that field. And again, the block will typically put more than one field on a form. This is an interesting example. I tried to save this form to continue on with it. You can see I'm getting a prompt for close reason A is required, close reason B is required. You'll see that sometimes with blocks, this case timely close block, even though I have it disabled, it's still picking up that there's some missing required fields here. So I have two choices at this point, depending on what I've been doing. I could just abandon this edit session by moving somewhere else and not trying to save this. And so if I knew if I wanted to leave my form as it was before, then I could do that. In this case, if I did want to save some other changes, I didn't want to lose those, I would just make those selections in there and then check my box to delete the existing disabled elements. That'll let me save my form. Right, so that is a dynamic form, and some of the things that you can do with it. As you can see, we didn't go through every single option, so there's a lot of different options there. But those are the basic functions that you'll typically be doing with the form. Moving things around, taking things off, adding things, making them required, not required. So let me flip over to a case. Let's look at an example of a static process. So if I go back to the Actions menu on a case, I'm going to click on Recommend Pro Bono Other User. So a couple of things have happened here because this is a static process and a static form. If I look at the URL, I can tell this is a static form because the word dynamic doesn't appear anywhere. And on this particular form, it even includes the word default, underscore PB, and so forth. And if I look at my admin menu, I can see I don't have an edit form link there. So if somebody comes to you and says, when we click on Recommend Pro Bono Other User, we don't want to see something on this page, or we want to change something about this page, and so forth. So again, the chances are that there's probably, maybe nothing that you can change on this page, unless there's something over on the process settings page that we'll look at here in a minute. Now, if you do run into a situation like that, because you're going to come across other static forms, you can always contact us and ask us, is there the ability somewhere to change this or to change that? But oftentimes, our response would be to you is, no, that's a static form, and so there's really nothing you can change about it. Coming back over to the help page, we have a section about converting from static to dynamic. I think, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, in terms of talking about the complexity of process management, one of the more complex things that you can get involved in is if you're using, for example, static time slips and you want to convert to dynamic, then this is what this section is talking about. And you can see there's 4 links to other help pages that go into sort of the nitty-gritty details about how you would do that. So, for example, if we look at briefly the page about customizing time entry, it shows you the steps that you would need to go through to convert from static to dynamic. And that's going to be building your data entry forms, setting up a profile page, which is actually optional, and then also setting your processes. And then there's some individual specific things about timekeeping that you need to deal with if you're going to be converting from static to dynamic. I mentioned a couple of times about the process settings page, and in this section we just call legacy process settings. It tells you that there are 3 different places you can potentially look to deal with the static processes and static forms and so forth. You might have some control over those. As it indicates here, primarily what these pages deal with some of the legacy links or the static links on a site. Let's take a look at the process settings page. If I go back to the main admin page, also in the process management section, we have the process forms and profiles link. We also have this process settings page. So there are quite a few different settings on this page. This lower section is the place where you would control some of the older legacy static links. Some of these you may not even see on your site. But for example, one that everyone will see is relevant here is this pending auxiliary process. What that is that you probably are familiar, if you've seen a pending case on your site, you'll know that it has a link in the snapshot area that says accept or reject. And so how do you control that particular link? Well, this is where you would do it over on the process settings page. And so this setting says which process do you want to invoke when somebody clicks on that particular link. And the drop-down list here is just all of the dynamic processes that have been set up on your site. If you left it at please select, then it would invoke a built-in, a static process and a static form. In this case, on this demo site, someone has gone in and created a dynamic form, a dynamic process, and now they're pointing that particular link to use that process. Some of these others, like change LSD eligibility process. If I go to back to our other demo site with the classic interface, I'll just bring up an example case, and I'll show you the link that is controlling. So actually, that section is not displayed on this demo site. All right, so I can't show you that. If your site's using the classic interface, you may have on your site over here on this right side a section that I believe the tab says eligibility or something like that. And then it has some eligibility information on it, and that there is a built-in link in that tab that says edit eligibility or edit LSD eligibility or something like that. And so again, if you were looking at your site and you saw that link, say, well, what can I do with that link? What happens with that link? What process is that calling? Then a good place to look would be on the process settings page, and this is what would control that link. And so it's either going to be at please select, which means there's a built-in static process and form, or has been selected here. Somebody's built a dynamic form, a dynamic process, and they've said, point that link to that particular process. We go back to the admin page and go into the timekeeping section or category. We have a link for timekeeping settings. Now, there's some settings on this page that affect, how the main timekeeping page itself looks. But if you come farther down, you'll see a static form settings and then a button for show static form settings. And if you click that button, it opens up a whole bunch of options. So as it explains to you on the customizing the time entry page, even if your site is still using the static built-in time slip forms and processes, you have a certain amount of control based on these older settings here. So, do you want to, the size of the confidential notes box? You want to show the activity code if it's an outreach time slip. You want to show the end court field, show the good story field, and several different things there that you can change. So as you can see from this list, even though for timekeeping it's somewhat extensive, you have much more control over your forms if they're dynamic than you do, just being limited to the set number of options that are here for the static forms. Also on timekeeping, you have a whole section for the processes. So is your site going to be showing dynamic processes and forms or static ones? On this demo site, you can see that the show add client time, this is no, which is saying don't show the built-in static link for add client time. You may recall when we looked at the processes, forms, and profiles page on this site, and I changed the module to timekeeping, we had a dynamic process in there for add case time. So for timekeeping, you can mix and match as this demo site is doing. The show add non-client time is set to yes. Show add outreach time is set to yes. So the static processes are going to be used there. I'll just quickly go to timekeeping to show you what I'm talking about. If I go to the actions menu on the main timekeeping page, if I put my mouse cursor over the add case time link, I can immediately see in the lower left of my browser, it shows me the URL that that's pointing to, and I can see dynamic in the word. Or if I clicked on add case time, it would show me in the URL at the top of the page that it was a dynamic form. In contrast, add non-client time, if I look at the URL for that, it just says service profile generic, and that's telling me that's a static form. The only control I have over that static form, if any, is going to be over on the timekeeping settings page. Same thing for the add outreach time link there. Also for end user roles and permissions, you have the ability to turn on and off some static process links. So if we go back to the user roles and permissions page, if we go into the administrator role, for example, you can see the option at the top here for add client time is checked. But this is going to relate to the static built-in time slip, which is not actually even being used on this site. So I could uncheck that permission from any role. And since the add client time, add case time type of time is being handled through the dynamic process, then I can control it there, and so this would actually have no effect. If we were still, this site was still using the static, add client time link, then this would actually have some control over it as well. And so there'll be a few of the permissions that will relate to some of the processes and forms and so forth that you're going to work on. So let me just uncheck that and save it. I'll go back to timekeeping and go back to actions. And as you can see, I still see the link there for add case time. That's because it's dynamic. And I can click on it, and I can use that form. Now, and just talking about permissions, we talked about a little bit earlier how one of the reasons that you may want to use dynamic processes and forms is because your dynamic processes, you can control each one of those individual processes per role. So it's sort of the flip side of what we just looked at. So instead of going into a role and looking to see if you already have a permission that would let you control that process or that link, if it's a dynamic process, you know you have that control and you can control it per role. So let me go to the admin edit form link here on this time slip. And so this is the back end of the timekeeping form. And so just like the intake form that we were working with earlier, it has enabled elements, and all these elements have options in them. In the top left here, which would be on the top right if you're in the classic interface, it also tells me the processes using this form. And so that's the add case time process, and it gives me a link to go directly to that process. Or I could go to the admin page, processes, forms, and profiles page, and then switch the module to timekeeping and then locate that process. This will let me go directly to the process. So the first thing that I wanted to point out here in terms of the process, we're talking about permissions, is you can see for each one of your processes, then you can control permissions by role. And so if I went in here, for example, and I changed the administrator permission to none, what that would do is it's going to hide this link for that particular role. You may notice that the special pro bono restricted access role for nearly all of your processes is going to have default permissions of none. So this can be helpful for something like timekeeping. So for some of our sites, for example, they have people that work in LegalServer, and they even may record certain types of time, but those people should never record case time. So all of those people can be given that other role. And in this case, maybe it's the volunteers. So maybe volunteers can do other things, but they should not be able to add case time. So it's very simple to come in here and set that to none. And then a volunteer, someone logging in with that role, would not be able to see the link. So let me just save this. I'm probably going to get an error page here, which we'll just ignore. Now I'm back on the main timekeeping page, and I've gone to Actions menu. You can see in the Actions menu, I don't see that link at all for Add Case Time because I turned it off for my particular role. So again, it's just a matter of more flexibility than with the static processes. What is in the user role permissions is a fairly fixed list, and so you may or may not have the ability to control a process link. So in the permissions, we saw we had a permission for add client time, which controlled that static add client time link, but you did not see one for add non-client time, add outreach time. So you couldn't take those away, so you have no control over those. But if those were dynamic processes on the site here, then we'd be able to control those like I just did the add case time link. All right, so I'm going to actually go back and change that permission so it doesn't confuse anybody else using our demo site. And since I can't hit the link to get the form up, I can't use my handy edit form link, so I just need to go back the long way. So admin, process management, processes, forms, and profiles. Change my module to timekeeping. And then so on the process list, there's my add case time process. I'll edit that. I'm going to come back and change my administrator role back to full permissions as well as the volunteer role. While we're here on the process, you can see some of the other things that you can change. The complete yes or no is just something that shows up on the list of processes, so that's just an internal thing for you as administrators. It may or may not be helpful to you to see that my process is complete or not. The active has a real effect. So if I mark this process as active no, then no one would see the add case time link on the main timekeeping page, because that would hide that link. A couple of other options there we won't go into in a lot of detail right now. Also in terms of working with your processes, this is where, again, a process just kicks off one or more forms, and this is where you specify that. And so for this particular process, we just have the one form on it. We also have a handy edit link here, so if you're looking at the process and you want to edit one or more of the forms that are in the process, then you can click that edit link instead of going back to the main process forms and profiles page. And you also set the profile page that is going to be displayed typically at the end of your process there. I'll click continue to save that, and I'll just come back to the timekeeping page and confirm that I have the add case time link there. Coming back over to the help page, you can see that we also talk about the different types of processes that you have. For your other modules, other than case matter, you have create processes, and then you also may have auxiliary processes. The create processes are the things that will create a record. So, add a new user, add case time, add a new outreach, so forth. That process then is going to call your form or forms to create a record in the database. Auxiliary processes are things that happen after a record is created. So typically these would be on your case matter module, also on outreach, to a lesser extent on time slips and things like that. But your auxiliary processes, you can think of, those are the things that happen after a case is open typically. So adding a note, adding time to a case, adding an assignment, editing assignments, and those types of things. Your create processes for the case matter module, they're not called create like you can see in the other modules, but they have your pre-screen processes and then also your intake processes. The permissions that we looked at on each process gives you a lot of control over what links show up and what links show up for which people. Also, the case dispositions to show relates to the case matter module. So do you want a link to show up based on certain dispositions? So for example, a reopen case link, you would typically only have that show up on closed cases and possibly rejected matters. But again, that also gives you control as well. So if you have a reopen case link, if you don't select rejected in the case dispositions to show, then somebody's looking at a rejected matter, they won't see the reopen case link, meaning they can't reopen a rejected matter. The forms we've also talked about in terms of editing your forms, also a discussion on the community page about the various types of forms. We've also kind of talked about those, intake forms, auxiliary forms, and so forth. And then we briefly talked about the various elements that you can put on forms. Profile pages, we haven't talked about editing the profile pages. It's kind of a topic unto itself. But hopefully you have a good feel now for what a profile page is. And if you needed to change a profile page, you would know where to go. So you would go into Admin Processes, Forms, and Profiles. And you have a tab called Profiles, and that's where your profile pages are going to be. Whether it's the main profile on a case or a profile for a time slip or a user record, whatever it happens to be. And then the final couple of topics on the process management introduction page are print profiles, which you may be familiar with, that in the classic interface on the right side of cases, you may see a print tab that has various links in it. Those are profile pages that you can edit. Those are always dynamic. So you can always go into Admin Processes, Forms, and Profiles. And on the Profiles tab, you'll be able to find any print files, edit those. And then the final topic mentioned down there is profile views. There's a whole help topic on that, kind of a big topic. It is a way to, just really briefly, it's a way to provide different views of a case. So if you're using the new interface, you have the main profile, which every site has to display cases. So you can define other profile views. So you can define, for example, like a foreclosure profile, a family law profile, and you have quite a few different options. Basically, it's just to have a case displayed differently, depending on certain factors like the legal problem code of the case or who's looking at the case. So that's a quick, albeit it took about an hour for an introduction to process management. So again, hopefully what you've taken out of this session is that a kind of general orientation, so you have a feel for what's involved, what's available. And if you're looking at any particular form or somebody comes and asks you a question about can we change this, can we change that, if you don't know the answer right off the top of your head, then you have an idea of where to start looking to see if you'll be able to make whatever change somebody's asking you to do. We are right at the hour. I don't see any questions posted, and I don't see any hands raised. I'll just give another couple of seconds here. If anybody's typing in a question, if you're in the middle of typing in a question, feel free to go ahead and just say, wait a second, and post that. I'll be happy to pause. All right, well, I don't see any questions being posted, no hands raised, so I think we will go ahead and wrap up. Hope everyone found the session helpful, and hope to see you on some future sessions. Goodbye, everyone.